Welcome everybody to the Economies and Neighbourhoods Scrutiny panel today. My name's Harpreet, I'm the chair of the Economies and Neighbourhoods Scrutiny panel. We've got some really good sessions on today, but we'll start with the membership of the committee, and I'll just go around the members first. So Richard Eastwood.
I think you're on mute, Councillor.
Yep, sorry. Yeah, Richard Eastwood, Lindley Ward.
Thank you. John?
John Taylor, the Cape Ward.
Thank you. Richard?
Richard Murgatroyd Goker.
Thank you. Peter?
Peter McBride, Cabinet Member responsible for regeneration and transportation.
Thank you very much. We're also joined by Lee, who's our governance officer, and Gareth, who's expertly helping us in the background with the IT. So thank you to both of them. We've also had apologies today from members. So from Chris Friend, Councillor Bolt, Councillor Hussain, Andrew Bird and Ailey Ogden, who are co-optees, and Councillor Mather, who normally joins as a cabinet member, has forwarded on her apologies as well. So we will move to minutes of the previous meeting. Do members accept those minutes? Correct record? Yep, John said okay. Richard, I don't think you were at the meeting, were you? Richard Eastwood was. No. Perfect.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask members if there's any interest that they want to declare at this stage. No, it doesn't seem that we've got any interests at this stage. Also, I'm sorry, I forgot one of our other cabinet members, Rob Walker. Rob, do you want to say hello?
Right. Thank you, Harpreet. Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Walker. I'm the Cabinet Portfolio Holder for Environment and Culture, and of relevance for today, also been looking after community COVID response in South Kirklees. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. I'm sorry I couldn't see everybody, so apologies for that. Thanks a lot. The meeting is taking place in public, so it's a virtual meeting with which the public can access. We've had no deputations or petitions at the moment, and we've not had any questions that have been submitted either. So our first session is on the community response. We've actually got quite a few colleagues here today. We're going to start off with Jill Greenfield and Carl Whistlecraft, and then we've got colleagues from the voluntary sector as well, and it'll be brilliant to hear from them. So if I could ask everyone just to go on mute, and then if Claire and sorry Claire, if Jill wants to come in and Carl wants to come in, sorry I was merging your names there, we'll let you both kick off. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Uppal. I'll start. Thank you for the invite today to Scrutiny. I'll just introduce the item, and then Carl will talk to some of the key points in the paper that's been shared today. I mean, really, it's great that we can be here to contribute and get the feedback from yourselves at Scrutiny about the crucial role that the voluntary and community sector plays in our economy, the delivery of services, connecting people, connecting and supporting communities, and importantly, as outlined in the paper, as seen in the recent and ongoing COVID response that we've had across Kirklees, and the invaluable role that voluntary and community organisations played in protecting and supporting all of our communities and residents. As you've seen, the report, officers have pulled that together. It is quite a lengthy report, and as I said, Carl will summarise some of those key points around the COVID response and the next steps, which is really based on the information that Scrutiny asked us to provide on the 4 key areas around the community response, the capacity of the voluntary community sector in communities, how COVID has impacted that capacity, and the ways in which that experience of the last 6 to 7 months influences our next steps. And importantly, we do have partners here, and it feels really valuable to get that insight and feedback from partners and from yourselves over and above officers talking about the paper. So if I just hand over to Carl, and he'll just summarise some of the key points in the paper as a refresh, and then we can get in that discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. In the spirit of officers not speaking too much, I'll try and keep this crisp and to the point. I think we've sort to pull the paper together, and I guess in 2 parts, which I guess the first half is very much for the panel, a detailed summary of the activities and the work that took place across the partnership in the context of the community response, and some of this may not be new to members of the panel, some of it may be, but hopefully we've sought to give a contextual flavour of, I guess, of what's been going on across the partnership over the last 6 months. And I think the important thing, and far be it for me to speak on behalf of colleagues in the voluntary and community sector, I think there has been a lot of positive things that have come out of the last 6 months, but I think similarly, I think individually and collectively, we've found a number of issues and learning points that hopefully in the second part of this paper gives the panel a bit of a flavour of what we're seeking to do in response to some of that learning, not least in terms of some of the relationship between the council and the voluntary and community sector, beginning to look in a bit more detail about how that funding relationship work, and not least building on some of the practical experiences as a result of the roles of the anchor organisations and the mutual aid groups. And I think, we want I think to take that as a platform to begin to move forward, not least in terms of having a different set of relationships and having a sort of different focus. But I guess it's building on that in terms of the relationships and the culture that we develop. So I don't want to speak in too much detail, because I think certainly the insight and perspectives of colleagues from the voluntary and community sector will particularly add value to this discussion, but hopefully the paper and the context that sits behind it, I guess, explains how we've got to here, some of the lessons we're beginning to learn along the way, but I guess some of the challenges that exist for the sector that I know colleagues will be able to build on in a much more detail than I can. I don't know if that's okay, Chair, or you want me to go into any further detail at this point.
I think that's fine. There's a lot of detail in the paper, so I hope that's okay for other members as well. And we'll move on to the VCS leads. Is that okay, members? I'm guessing that's okay. So we'll move on. Oh, I'm getting a nodding head from John. So we'll move on to the next person. So can I introduce them? Yeah, okay, I'll introduce. So we'll start off with Paul Bridges from Huddersfield Mission. Paul, are you able to turn your camera on? It might already be on, I can't see you, but are you able to talk about your experiences?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all and join this scrutiny panel. I guess it comes as no surprise to say that these are difficult times for the voluntary and community sector, and I think I would highlight that they are particularly difficult for those organisations that base their income and their business model, if you like, on a number of key factors. So I think what I'd like to do is highlight those factors, which I'm highlighting because they affect us here at Huddersfield Mission. And then others can say how their experience reflects that or is slightly different. So I think that there are 4 things I want to say. Firstly, that those of us that try very hard to generate some of our income and not to be relying on grants, invariably that has been massively affected by the current situation. So for us, that's our cafe and our room hire, which are, currently running at somewhere between 10 or 20% of normal. That's just not sustainable in the long term. For those of us who have used the furlough scheme, that is coming to an end. And although there is the job retention scheme, the difference in the level of support that gives is really quite significant, and not one that can easily be managed. Thirdly, for those organisations that rely on fundraising and donations, then I think that may depend on the individual organisation, but for us, we've seen a big hit there as well. Most of our donations are by people that come into the building. They're not coming into the building, and people can't do fundraising events, or at least not quite so many. There's only so many people that can walk around their garden over and over again. And then lastly, I think I just want to highlight that all of those issues are likely to be exacerbated, particularly for people that manage or own a building, and the real challenges of that. And if we look sort of longer term, I guess I want to say together, because I think, you know, it's a sort of a shared responsibility. Our buildings, whether we're faith-based organisations such as the Mission, or we're community centres run by the local authority, or broader voluntary sector buildings, we provide something for the whole of Kirklees, and we want it to be around for the long term. So we do need to find some solutions so that the resource that the voluntary sector is long term remains there. So they're the sorts of issues that I will pick up on. I can say in more detail if people want what that actually means for the Mission, but I'll stop there at the moment.
Thank you for that, Paul. That's been really helpful. After we've spoken to everybody, I know we'll want to come back and have some further discussions with you. So we'll probably pick up that point further on if that's okay, but thank you so much for that. So next I will introduce Andy Petrie from Local Services to You. I should say, actually I didn't say that at the beginning, but Local Services to You are based in my ward, and we've been working with them quite closely through the COVID pandemic as well, because they're our community anchor. So I'll just mention that. So Andy Petrie, do you want to pop on your video and have your great stuff?
I've got my video on, whether you can see it or not. And I think, like you said, we are based in your ward, and I think right at the outset, I think we had some of the ward members delivering shopping as part of the community response as well. And I think for me, the community response paper captures some of what we did, but I think some of the real detail and energy and really good stuff that went on as part of it, it's difficult to capture in reports. I think the community response kind of showed what was possible and how we can work within communities as a local authority, as community organisations, as in partnership, and as the paper sets out, it's kind of how we build on that for the future. I think it has impacted on different parts of the sector very differently, as Paul set out. Some organisations are really struggling. It's the same with the wider economy. Some businesses have been hit massively. Some have been okay. And for me, it's how do we develop this? How do we take the short-term action that we need to sustain the bits of the sector and the economy that we need for our kind of long-term vision of what Kirklees society will look like? I think that's one of the real challenges. It is an opportunity to do things differently, but there's some critical organisations that can play a part in that in the future that are really struggling now. That we want to be around in a year and 5 years' time. So for me, I think that's one of the real challenges. I think the response, I mean, I could go on for ages about the community response and what happened, but I will keep it short. I think that the partnership working and relationships were critical to the effectiveness of it. I know that some of the work we were able to do was because we had the good relationships with individual officers, with members, with partner organisations, with community groups and families in the area, which meant we could respond very quickly to situations and provide support, you know, within hours where needed. Those relationships, we've always said, are really important, and how those relationships develop in the future and partnership is, I think, will depend on those relationships. It's difficult to say exactly how that we want that relationship to work in every area. Sometimes we as a community anchor, as an organisation, want to be able to say, just let us get on with it. We know what we're doing, we're fine. Other times we'll need to say, do you know what, we need a hand with this, we need support. And that will differ on what the topic is and what the situation is. But having that relationship with the local authority, with health partners, with other community anchors, means we can have those conversations. And I think we got some really good examples of situations where we worked out between us who was best placed to deal with it. Sometimes we would say to a local authority officer, it's okay, it's fine, we can do that. Other times we'd say, this needs to go back to you, you need to be able to sort this. And being able to have those conversations where who was best placed to resolve the situation did it was really important, and something we want to keep hold of. So, I'd just like to say thanks for inviting us along to talk about it. It's been an interesting experience, and there's lots of lessons for the future. I'm sort of kind of optimistic, despite where we're at with everything with coronavirus at the moment, that we can take the lessons from this and really build on it to accelerate, I think, the work that was going on already, the discussions that were being had about place-based working, about community wealth building, about keep it local, were already happening before this happened. I think this has accelerated it to some extent. But I'll leave it for now and let some of my other colleagues have a say as well also. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. That's been really helpful. Thanks so much. And we've also got Val Johnson from Third Sector Leaders. So I'll pass on to Val now.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me along this afternoon. I think both Paul and Andy are too modest, really, to say what terrific work they did during the COVID response. But before I say how wonderful they were, I'd like to pick up on the points that they both made about relationships. The whole concept of community anchors was relatively new at Third Sector Leaders. We'd got some funding from West Yorkshire and Health Integrated Care System to look at establishing community anchors in the primary care networks, to try and give the voluntary and community sector a greater role in health. This had only just been established when COVID hit us in March, and we were really impressed with the way that Jill and her colleagues in Community Plus embraced the idea of having a trusted local organisation on the ground to work with the council's community hub responses, and made that funding available within about 3 days, I think. I've never known money turned around so quickly. It was a fantastic, flexible response, and the faith that she showed in the local voluntary and community sector to work alongside colleagues in the council was very impressive. And I think that's one of the key lessons, really. Whatever difficulties there might have been with relationships that we're exploring in some evaluations, that initial response was terrific. The community anchors did, I think they did a great role, and we all know how many local people wanted to help, and we had hundreds of people saying, how can I get involved? How can I help? Coming to mutual aid groups, and then struggling in lots of instances as to what to do. And I think Andy and Paul and our other anchors did a great role in offering support, in being that listening ear, in being there. And it was, in lots of instances, 7 days a week, answering, particularly at the beginning, answering queries. So that was all positive. I think the fact that we showed that local people can come together and create local solutions is a real lesson for the future to take forward into place-based working. If local people can organise shopping for their neighbours, then they can organise lots of other things if we put the right support in place. Moving forward, I think Paul picked up some of the key issues, really, in that, in terms of the capacity of the sector, those organisations that have been grant funded or have contracts, contract managers within the council have been incredibly flexible at letting people adjust what they're delivering. Most grant managers have been really flexible as well. It's organisations that were income generating organisations that have been particularly hit, and particularly community buildings. I've got lots and lots of examples I won't speak about this afternoon, but I'd be happy to share a small paper we're pulling together that details those examples. Just to pick out a few, whether you're a big organisation like Yorkshire Children's Centre had 3 charity shops that provided substantial amounts of money to help its services with local families and children. They've had to close 2 of those and make the staff redundant. Their 1 remaining shop contributed 120,000 to the organisation in the last financial year, and in this year they expect it'll contribute £12,000. Then at the other end, you've got smaller community centres. The Trinity Centre in Batley is an example of a community centre. It was set up in a church with Batley City Challenge money many years ago, and it's been one of those organisations that has brought in about £15,000 a year through room hire and various fundraising events, and it spent that amount on running the building. It's been a balancing the books, if you like, group. But like all community centres, they're not getting any rental income. They're really struggling with how to reopen and what the guidance means. And if they can open groups, it's substantially reduced income and they can't do their fundraising events. Organisations that are based in churches have been particularly hard hit because they haven't been eligible for the small business grant that a lot of centres have got. So they've missed out on that opportunity. And I think what our community buildings are looking for, I think everybody appreciates that there are so many sectors that are hit. Our pubs, our cafes, our hospitality. We could go on, our arts centre. But I guess I'm here today to make a special plea for community buildings. I hope very much that local councillors will be able to support their local buildings. I'd like to work with council officers on trying to get the best possible advice out as to what buildings can do, how they can open safely, and if we can look at any kind of financial support to help people open and to keep going, because I think we all know that there's lots of inequalities between our communities in Kirklees and in the more affluent areas. There's more support, more resources, and I'm really concerned that in some of our poorer communities where there's perhaps a community building where it's where everything happens in that community, we just can't afford to lose them. And thank you very much for letting me talk today.
Thank you, Val. That was really useful. I want to thank all our community and voluntary colleagues there. They've really set out some of the key issues, some of the really good things that have happened, but also some of the key issues going forward for the sector. And we know just how important they are, and they've really put that across today. So thank you for that. Before we just move on to members' questions, I just want to ask Councillor Walker, because it comes on partly under your brief. Did you want to come in and say anything at this stage?
I'll be very brief, just to say that I think the response of the community sector in the crisis has been absolutely fantastic. I think right across the patch, North and South Kirklees, there have been some fantastic things that have happened. Some of them from existing groups, such as the groups that have formed the anchor organisation, and existing groups such as the Mission that we've heard about, but also those groups which spontaneously arose, sometimes just based around Facebook groups, which have done some amazing work. So that's it really at this stage, just to say that as a councillor, I'm massively appreciative of the community effort. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. So members, I just want to check if you want to come in now and ask any questions. It's a bit difficult for me because I can't see everybody. I assume members have got their videos on. So does anyone want to ask a question now? Yes, Councillor Murgatroyd. You're on mute, Councillor Murgatroyd. You're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo all the points that have been made about how well the voluntary sector has responded, but also in terms of the local community. I just wanted to just raise a few kind of ideas really and points, and I'd be interested to hear what people's thoughts were. I mean, first of all, I think everyone, Paul and Val and everyone, has flagged up the serious, well, threat really to our existing community assets and buildings. So I guess it would be useful to hear a bit more about the response from the from Kirklees to assist them. I know a lot of assistance has gone in already, and it's certainly on the radar of the council. So that perhaps hear a little bit more about that. But the other thing I just wanted to ask about was so what seems to have happened is that the mutual aid groups, which we all agree have been really quite inspiring and essential, but for various reasons, people returning to work, tiredness, various reasons, a lot of the mutual aid groups have kind of aren't as active or have lost a lot of potential volunteers. So I guess the question I wanted to ask really was what people think about what scope there would be for the council itself to actually act as a kind of catalyst in terms of identifying new potential volunteers, or perhaps we could call them active citizens moving forward. And because I don't know if people recall, the government did actually kind of call for national NHS volunteers and built, and I believe hundreds of thousands of people came forward at the start of the crisis. And so I suppose what would be ideal is if we could start developing a register of potential active citizens, across Kirklees, and because community groups, obviously they do need buildings, they need solid assets, they need staff, they need funding, but above all they need volunteers, they need active citizens in communities supporting them as well. So yeah, I mean, that's my question really, is what is the scope for us as a council to actually kind of facilitate, perhaps to even organise a process whereby we draw up a register of potential active citizens moving forward, because I think we'll all agree they're really going to be needed over the next period. So that was it really.
Thank you, Richard. Carl or Jill, do you want to come in on that point?
Do you want me to, Carl?
Yeah, you
I'll start.
Yeah, fine.
I'll start and Carl will add in. I think the community buildings issue is really key, councillor, and we have held a number of community building webinars, and that has also been peer led by some of our VCS partners who've had really good experience and have been able to share that. But I think, as you rightly point out, there is some more work for us to do on that, and I know colleagues have been looking at that. So I think unless other officers have something to contribute at that, I think that's something we need to take away to that existing work programme and build upon that. In terms of your second point around that ongoing, I suppose, community resilience, that again is very much in our mind. The really localised response, neighbour to neighbour support was absolutely phenomenal, and it is something, as you say, that we're going to need and to be able to foster going forward, and also to support us in developing that longer term resilience. Not that I want to wish other crises or pandemics upon us or floods, etc., but those are things that we do need to make sure that we've got insight going forward. I'll open up to other officers if there's any other specifics to add to that, but I will take away with Carl the next community webinar, because I think building webinar, because we do need to relook at that in some of the change in guidance, which I know some of our colleagues have been doing.
Just to very briefly add, in terms of the volunteer, I mean the paper that we put in front of you, there's brief reference to a piece of work that Andrew Dolman did, which just basically referred to the council, so the volunteers that came to the council. But I think we can send you the more detailed version of that. I think what was quite interesting is, picking up Councillor Murgatroyd's point, is that it demonstrates it's a very, very sort of fluid area, and I think circumstances wholly affected the volunteering capacity as we were in the start of the pandemic, and then circumstances changes, people's availability changes, and actually it's moving that volunteering approach beyond the sort of pandemic response into a sort of, I guess, more routinized way of working. And I'm interested in third sector colleagues' views on what the council's role and place is in that space, because I think it's interesting, isn't it, the extent to which we enable and create the conditions and not seek to control and directly coordinate. And I know that's not what you're suggesting, but I think it's really timely to think about actually what is the partnership's role in that volunteering, I guess, landscape, and within that the councils, and interested in views on that.
Sorry there, I was just having a few problems with my headset there, so I've just had to turn it off. So I'm hoping you can still hear me. Sorry, I just missed the last bit of what Carl said there, but what I'll do for now is we'll move on to John Taylor for now, so you can ask his question. Paul, do you want to come in on the point that Carl had just made?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah.
Is that for me?
Yes. Go ahead, Paul, and then John.
So in terms of my view, I mean, I've been trying to work out how I might word this, because the voluntary and community sector is, of course, an independent sector, and that's much of its strength and its value. But we work in partnership with both the broader community and, of course, the council and other statutory sector partners. So it's a really difficult one to answer in terms of what is actually needed as we go forward. But without being overly dramatic, I do think that we do need. It's been fantastic to have the community buildings webinars and support, which quite rightly has been focused on the immediate. But I guess the question for me is about the more medium and long term, and I think we need to be prepared to ask the serious question that if we want that those community assets and the resilience that having community buildings and community organisations that gives all of us, then how do we do that? And whilst normally that might be ultimately, on a day-to-day basis down to me and my trustees for here at the mission, the circumstances that we face at the moment are, it seems to me, so out of the ordinary that we may need solutions that are out of the ordinary as well. I hope that tries to answer the question. I'm desperately trying to find a middle ground where I'm not saying we need someone else to just step in and bail us out, because I don't think that, and that shouldn't be our response. But we do need to work very seriously together.
Thank you, Paul. And I mean, the sustainability of financing was a key point in the health partnership report as well. And I'm sure we're thinking about the long-term aspects. I'm going to bring in Councillor Taylor, and then I'll bring you in Councillor Walker, if that's okay. So, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, this is a scrutiny meeting, so I'm just going to put it out there. We shouldn't really have brought Councillor Walker in before members, because actually we're here to scrutinise the executive. So you shouldn't really be bringing the cabinet members in first to speak. So can we just remember that we are a scrutiny meeting here? And a lot of my comments are in that vein about how we scrutinise what's been presented before us and how we ask questions around it.
Can I just come back on that, Councillor Taylor? So I agree with what you're saying. That's spot on. I only brought him in because to be able to summarise, if you wanted to bring a summary on the points, and I think that's fair enough given it's part of his.
I would say it'd be far better if we were able to get him to respond to the scrutinisation rather than having his say before we've had the opportunity to scrutinise what's been presented before us.
Of course, but I think he should also have the opportunity to be part of the presentation. But he will, of course, answer all the questions. So I'll let you go ahead. Go ahead, John.
And there's quite a lot that I want to talk about, really. I mean, I think it has been, as everybody has said, an unprecedentedly difficult 6 months. But also within that, there's an awful lot of things that, to me, shine out in terms of the way that the community and that everybody, and I use that word community very loosely there, have responded, and I think it has been fabulous, and there's a lot of learnings to take from that. But focusing in on what we're here for today in terms of scrutiny, one of the things I found difficult with the paper is, whilst it presents a lot of information, I feel that it doesn't discriminate well enough between impacts of the pandemic and issues that were within communities before the pandemic came along. And so, for example, when we talk about the number of people that are accessing food banks or the number of people that needed support, some of those people needed support prior to COVID coming along, will need support after the pandemic has gone away. So really, what we need to be looking at and understanding is what was caused by the pandemic, or what was already there that may have been an unfulfilled demand, quite possibly, and what the pandemic has done is surface things that were already there. But we shouldn't just put it all down and say, well, everything is as a result of the pandemic, because we would be making a false assumption there. Similarly, there's a comment in here about the significant impact on our BME community, which we know and we recognise, but what we haven't done is done the analysis to see whether whether that impact is as a result of them being a member of the BME community, or is it down to the fact that they live in perhaps multi-occupancy housing, or they have a job that requires them to work in a way that perhaps isn't as COVID secure as other roles are. And so actually you might find that if you looked at a different criteria, you might find similarities that we're not looking at the moment, because we're just taking one lens and making an assumption based on that lens. So I just think there's more work to be done in that kind of space as well. We've talked a lot about the community buildings and community assets, and I must confess I have for a long time been a skeptic of the council's approach to try and offload difficult buildings onto the community and then expect the community to deal with the consequences of that. And you know, in my own ward, was involved in some of the discussions and debates about having to take over our own libraries if that had ever come to pass. So I have huge sympathy with the voluntary sector and those organisations that have stepped in, where they've stepped in to keep a community asset going because the council was pulling away from it. And whilst they probably have had in place business plans that coped with normal situations, they won't have had business plans that cope with out of the ordinary. And I think Paul was just making that point just before I spoke. And I think we do need to be looking at those business plans again, and going forward, if there are any more assets that the council is attempting to offload onto communities, that we've done the proper due diligence around those business cases, that aren't just that they have adequate resources and capacity to cope with the ordinary, but we've looked at what would happen in an extraordinary situation. Because what we don't want to do is hand these assets over to the community and then find that they fail the first time we're hit by some unexpected outcome like this. On volunteering, I mean, I agree with the comments that have been made about the changing nature of volunteering, and people that, as furloughs come to an end and people have been returning to work, their capacity is changing. But I do think there is another silver lining to that cloud. What we are also seeing is a lot of people that are either partly or fully working from home. And I actually think there is opportunities for people who are doing that to still engage in some volunteering. So, you know, I know of people in my community, not actually in my village, but in neighbouring villages, where they've returned to work, but they're still managing to do shopping for a neighbour, or they're still picking up prescriptions for people because they're fitting it in and around their working from home, because that working from home by its very nature is giving them much more flexibility. So we need to grab hold of that and look at that as a potential future model, because it isn't going to be that people will be available all of the day, but they probably will be able, and I'm sure most employers would be considerate and encouraging of their employees to work in that manner. So I think that's worth picking up and taking away. Just a specific, and it's probably me being a bit daft, Chair, but on page 9, it talks about PCNs. I don't know what a PCN is.
It's a primary care network.
Ah, right. Sorry.
Yeah. But it's a good point. It's a good.
There are a number of it. When we get onto the planning one later on, there's a few in there as well. And I have no idea what they're talking about. And obviously, the officer that's written it knows exactly what they're talking about. But there is a difficulty there. And then a final one, which is not really to do with this, but it's a request probably to Jill. I've seen an email that's come out today, one of the COVID updates, that talks about the launching of a track and trace support payment, where we're going to provide some funding to people who have to self-isolate. If, you know, track and trace contact them and say you've been in contact with somebody who has tested positive. I just wonder if there's anything that can be shared with us as councillors, Jill, or if we can ask the comms guys to get us something that we can then stick on social media for you. So I think it's really important to get that message out really, really quickly. And I'm not sure me just cutting and pasting an email is probably the best way to do that. So I'm just abusing this meeting to get that message across to you. So I think it's something we could all do really helpfully, if you wouldn't mind picking that one up for me. And I'll leave it there, Chair. Sorry for just throwing that one in at the end.
No, of course, John. And you know what, John, we're going to make sure Councillor Walker responds to everything that you've just said there as well, which is very important. You're absolutely right. So I'll tell you what, I'll bring Councillor Walker in first, and then we'll bring Jill in. So Councillor Walker, I don't know if you can respond to some of the points that Councillor Taylor's made there. Yeah.
Thanks, John, for the points you've raised there. I think you've raised some extremely important points. So thanks for that, and I will have a look at that. I'll concentrate perhaps on the first three. The point you made about the people who are coming forward needing help, about to what extent is that just the impact of the pandemic, or does it actually reflect longer term issues in the community? I think that's a really, really important issue, and I think it is something that requires further work for us to analyse that. My own view, without any research, is that there are some really serious issues around inequalities and around what I see as the failure of the benefit system. I'm not sure at the moment the benefit system, with the way it's constituted and the level of benefits, whether that is actually adequate to meet people's needs. And in my view, it is something that needs to be addressed. I think we need to look at it at a council level, but I also I think it's something that we need to look at in terms of our national politics as well. So I completely agree with you. And I think it will be good, going forward, if we can work across parties within Kirklees to look at some of these issues and really debate them in council meetings and so on. The impact on the BAME communities, again, I agree with you. We need to look at why certain communities have been impacted more adversely by the epidemic and the degree to which it's affected by things like housing situations, the kind of work people are doing, underlying health conditions and things. Again, I completely agree with you. I think we need to do more work on this. And I do suspect that it will bring out evidence of real issues, particularly around inequalities that need to be tackled going forward. With community buildings, like yourself, John, I've been very much involved with community buildings and with asset transfers. I've also been part of the cross-party asset transfer group within the council. I'm actually, you talk about offloading buildings, and possibly that might stick, I think, with some of the early asset transfers. But I think increasingly the focus has been on trying to ensure that when a building is transferred into the community, it has got a viable long-term future. And I've been impressed really with the discussions that have taken place within the committee. And for example, around the new policy that was adopted at the Cabinet not long since. I think each year with the new iterations of that policy, it is improving. But I do think going forward, we need to do more looking at these buildings that have been transferred to view them as an asset for the wider community, where the council still has an important responsibility to provide support, which may be support in terms of advice, linking in with other organisations and things. It may, in certain situations, involve looking at possibly providing greater financial support. And I do know that there are buildings that have been asset transferred that during the current crisis have received support to enable them to function more effectively. On your volunteering point, yeah, I completely agree again with what you're saying. That was what actually I put up my hand earlier to speak about. The point I was going to make was that I think the report underestimates the number of people who have volunteered. I think there have been a tremendous number of people, many of them doing it on a fairly informal basis through the mutual aid groups who possibly haven't appeared on the official statistics. And I think one point I want to perhaps raise is that I think early on there was an issue in some areas that people who were volunteering were not able to find worthwhile things for them to do. There were more volunteers than there was work to do. And I think going forward, as the number of volunteers possibly diminishes, as Councillor Murgatroyd said earlier, the people who don't come forward, we need to make sure that we're supporting them and making sure that their talents, the things they want to do, we're linking those where there is a need. So I think that's where there is definitely a role for third sector leaders and for the anchor organisations in terms of bringing together, brokering almost, the volunteers with the opportunities out there in the community. And remember as well that people do gain benefits from volunteering. It can be an excellent way for people who are isolated and perhaps a little bit lonely to get out there and do something. And there's nothing better for people than to feel that they are doing something that's benefiting other people in their community. Right, so I think I've covered most things there, John. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Councillor Taylor just wants to come back in.
Yeah, couple of things to come back on. On the inequalities stuff, Rob, what I was trying to say was, I think if you just look at it through one lens, you may miss some people. So I think that what we saw with the BME community being more adversely impacted, some of that will relate to poorer housing, poorer health outcomes, etc. But there are people who aren't in the BME community that are in poorer housing, that have poorer health outcomes, and we're not focusing on them because we're just looking at it through one lens. That's what my big worry is about this.
Right.
We need to. That's why we need to look more widely and understand what commonality there is in terms of causes, rather than it's almost too easy to just assume it's because of their ethnicity, whereas actually it might be their living, where they're living, the type of work that they're doing, the fact that they're in a multi-occupancy house or whatever it may be. But then there will be other people who don't have their ethnicity that have those similar sort of backgrounds, and we should be supporting them as well. And at the moment we're in danger of not doing that. So that was that one. On the number of volunteers, you're absolutely right that the numbers are underplayed here, because in my community, I'm in my own village of Shepley, I set up the COVID response team, and we haven't responded to anybody. We haven't done anything. I had a number of volunteers who haven't actually done any work at all. That's because neighbours have helped each other out, and they probably don't even recognise that they're volunteering. All they're doing is being a good neighbour, so that, you know, the elderly lady next door or across the road is you know, self-isolating, so I'll go and pick up a shopping for her. They don't recognise it as volunteering. So you're absolutely right that there are ones there that we're not picking up, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a sign of a good community, isn't it? I'll leave it there, Chair.
Councillor Walker, do you want to just respond to those points?
Yeah, again, I agree with John, really. I do think it's getting the balance, really, isn't it? I think we have got to recognise that within BAME communities, they have been more adversely affected nationally and within Kirklees. So we shouldn't ignore that. But I do also take your point that there are other factors other than people's ethnicity that do seem to have had a big effect on how people are impacted. And we have to be very careful that we're looking at those other factors and we're not neglecting other communities. You know, I do worry that sometimes in wards like yours and like mine, the rural wards, that we do have pockets of real deprivation that sometimes can be forgotten about, given the fact that overall our wards are a bit more affluent than other wards within Kirklees, and we shouldn't forget those people. And we need to use different lenses, as you say, to make sure that we're capturing the full picture so that we can do something about things. Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Jill, I don't know if you could come back on Councillor Taylor's point about the self-isolation payments and about making sure we get the information out.
Yeah, there are some planned comms, Councillor Taylor, and I'll take that back absolutely to make sure that that councillors have got something readily shareable, so that you can make sure that's distributed among people who need to know about it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, if it can be social media friendly, because I can get on Facebook groups and that sort of stuff in the community. I'm sure most councillors can do that for us.
Of course.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm just going to ask Councillor Eastwood, do you have any questions? Councillor Eastwood.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah,
yes.
just turning it off so I can speak.
Brilliant.
Yeah, my questions would be, I know from a fact that some volunteers who volunteered right at the very beginning have been very little used. and now that they're back working, if you like, it's been a missed opportunity of making of using their services that they were offering, which is a shame. Obviously, everybody's doing the best in terms of the voluntary sector. I know from personal experience how awkward it is for those whose income streams have plummeted, and how much financial help as a council we can offer those particular charities or whatever. I think we probably need to look at that a bit more, because I'm sure there's more help that we can offer. I'm surprised that of the people that have come forward, that there weren't more. I find that in a 6-month period that's quite a low number. I mean, I might be wrong, but I think that's a bit of a low number, and it might be down to people's pride coming forward and asking for help, and how we can actually get the message out to them to shout out if you to shout out. There's nothing worse than suffering needlessly when help is available. So it's how do we get the message across to those people? Really, that's about it, really.
Thank you, Councillor Eastwood. I think that's a very good point, actually, and that was one of the questions I was going to ask: is how do we know we've reached everyone that we want to reach? Because there's always that unknown, isn't there, really, which is tricky. I'm going to just get a response from Jill and Carl or Councillor Walker on Councillor Eastwood's points, and then we'll come back to John, if that's okay.
Would you like me to come in, Chair?
Yes, please do. Yeah, thanks, Jill.
Yeah, I think the approach that we tried to take tried to resolve that. What is it we don't know? And that was employing all 3 key elements of the council response, voluntary and community sector response through the anchors, but also the really hyper-localised neighbour approach for our mutual aid groups through just that neighbourly support. And when I say just, I mean just self-organising, not that it was any less important. And hopefully across those 3 elements we were able to capture as much as we could. I know the council also worked with partners to look at vulnerable individuals and families throughout COVID as well, monitoring closely the impact on some of our known cohorts where vulnerabilities may have been the impacts would have been more expected to have been more adverse from some of our vulnerable families, mental health, adults, etc. So that is an ongoing piece of work, and I think relates to some of the existing health inequalities, going back to further points that perhaps COVID has exacerbated as well as created its own issues. So I think to be really honest, we never know if we've not missed anybody at all, but we have worked tirelessly to try and make sure that our system captures from the very local neighbour to neighbour support to known cohorts that we know about across our statutory partners. And that's an approach that we continue to employ in the work that we do going forward, but it is something that we have to continually monitor, and working with our public health and evaluation colleagues as well, we're able to make sure that we keep that lens on the work that we're doing. I don't know whether that answers everything Councillor Eastwood wanted to touch on that point.
Councillor Eastwood, did you want to come back on anything there?
No, you're fine.
Okay, all right. You're fine.
And then just thank you. And then just touching on the volunteers, I think absolutely there has been a massive underreporting of, we can't capture all the volunteering that happens. We've captured a significant amount. We've captured a significant amount of the help that all parts of our community response have responded to, but again, that hasn't accounted for absolutely everything. I think it's testament to the amount of work that all elements have done, that if we're looking that we've captured part of that, that there has been it's a fairly safe assumption to make that a lot of work has happened additionally to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor?
Yeah, apologies. I should have mentioned this earlier. And Carol and Jill will not be surprised at me raising this. I rarely attend meetings without finding some opportunity to raise libraries. But again, we're talking about volunteering, and we have library volunteers who are itching to get back into their libraries and enable us to open our libraries, albeit in a COVID secure way, for longer hours. And also, you know, we can't underestimate how important it is to enable the public to have access to public access computers as well, particularly in the more rural areas where it's not as easy to get into the town centre. So it's just another plea again, Jill, that can we get on with this? We're talking about encouraging people to volunteer. We're talking about encouraging them to volunteer in various ways. Here's a way: there are people who are wanting to volunteer, and as yet the council still hasn't managed to get there. So it's just another plea on that. And I would just echo what Richard was saying just now about with some people being too proud to ask for help. And in many ways, some of that, you know, good neighbour and the more informal stuff has helped in some of those situations. And then the other thing I would say was, one thing I was really pleased to see and a bit amazed about was in the early days of the lockdown, how the library staff were ringing everyone who was over 70 to just check on them. So to the point about how did we identify everybody who needed help, that was another example of how, you know, the staff just got on with it and were doing what they could to identify anybody who might need that support and help in those early days, just, you know, using the data we had to contact people. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McBride, I think you wanted to come in.
Just a quick one. I think the council has adapted its role because initially, particularly with buildings, we sought to retreat, to sell and so on. Over a period, we've done something much more than that. We've learned to work with communities, how to help them manage buildings, work with us, and that's been a growing ability, and I think far more effective. So that many of the later transfers have been so much more effective because it involved much more than a transfer of a building. It's an exchange of functions and relationships. But bear in mind, the crisis, the council was facing enormous cuts and it was, as it were, retreating from different areas. It's now learned to work with organisations far more effectively than it had previously. And from this, it's always something good comes out of a bad situation. A really developed and mature working relationship has occurred between council officers, voluntary workers and voluntary organisations. And I'm very proud to see what has emerged from that. And of course, councillors had a big part to play in the redeveloping of those functions.
Okay, thank you, Councillor McBride. I think this session's been really, really interesting, and there's obviously been some brilliant work done in the community response and by our voluntary and community partners as well. But there's obviously some very key challenges going forward, particularly in terms of the capacity of the sector and for them to income generate, as Paul mentioned as well, in terms of community buildings. I am quite concerned about that, and some of that is out of our hands as well, because there's issues nationally, no doubt, around this. But I would just like to know perhaps how we're planning to move forward with the community anchor role, and also in terms of that longer term, that medium to longer term support for the voluntary and community sector and the community buildings, because I think we've realised more than ever just what an important part they play in communities. and it'd be useful to get a bit of a bit more detail around that from colleagues. But before our voluntary and community sector partners go, I don't know if each one of you can say what would be the one key thing that you think at a local level that we can help you with. So Paul, maybe if we start with you.
That's not fair to start with me. I didn't get much time to think my thoughts through last time. The one thing, you know, it is really difficult. I mean, I raised the whole of this issue because I really wasn't sure of a way forward. So I'm going to say two things. One, to have a dialogue. Let's keep this dialogue going, and that's really key. And I think the second thing would be linking community anchors with community buildings, because they're not exactly the same, but if we could agree a longer term strategy around community anchors, that would give at least part of my organisation and other organisations a level of security. So that's sort of perhaps one practical thing. And I should have said it earlier, and Andy reminded me, we've had some very specific pieces of help, things that we could not do ourselves. And I'm just going to highlight your finance department, who really helped us do something that we couldn't do. And I've thanked them individually. But I think those sort of things were really helpful as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for joining us as well today. Andy, Petra, if you could say what your key thing would be.
Well, I've had a bit more time than Paul to think, and I'm still not sure I can come up with something. I think recognise that the solutions in each area are going to be different, and that dialogue. I mean, Paul mentioned dialogue. Talk to us about what's needed. I think what's happened with the community anchor role is that it's there's resource being provided, and what we've been able to do with that, I think, has been incredible, and it's been very different in each area. For us, we've been able to set up projects, initiatives, support groups, all sorts of things that some of the things we'd wanted to do before because they were addressing needs that were already there. For example, children and families, we do a lot of work with. So I think it's be open about how the anchor role can look across the areas, and really have that dialogue and trust us, and develop that trusted relationship, really.
Thank you, Andy. That's really helpful. Thanks a lot. And Val?
Yes, I would echo the need for dialogue. It would be great to work with local councillors, local council officers and the sector on a strategy for community buildings so that we can see which ones we really need to save if it comes to the crunch. I think I'd also like to look at where council funding is available, that it can support some of the sustainability of community buildings, because most funds are very much that are available to the sector are very much around new projects, and sustainability really is the crucial for community buildings. They're not wanting to do something new or develop new projects. They just want to survive and be there to do the job they're already doing in their local communities.
Thank you, Val. That's really helpful. Thank you so much to our third sector partners there. Can I just ask Carl, Rob or Jill to respond on those points? I think that that sustainability of funding is going to be key, and obviously that sustainability around community building support is as well. So I don't know if one of you can respond on that. Rob, yeah.
Yeah, I think as someone myself who's worked in third sector organisations with community groups for a long time, I think Val's hit on a really important point there, that money's often available for new projects, but it's actually sustaining things, covering costs, which can be the real problem for organisations who are doing really good work to carry on doing that really good work. And I think that's a national issue. I think it's linked in with the culture we've got of bidding for new projects rather than thinking about funding things in the longer term. But it is something that even if we don't get the changes I'd like to see at a national level, we should be looking to address it locally within the council, working with our partners in the third sector. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think, Carl, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to build on Councillor Walker's point, I think some of the points raised in the second half of that report, I think demonstrate that there are, I guess, a number of important ingredients that go to begin to solve some of the issues and challenges that have been raised today. I think the changing relationship between the council and the voluntary community sector, and how does that reflect itself in the funding arrangements and the contracts that we have, and similarly a more joined up and consolidated approach to funding. I think that's just a set of things that are fundamentally important. And I guess some of the wider strategic issues that come out of discussions like this is what is the role of anchor organisations moving forward, what is the relationship with the council, and how does that translate itself into our policies and subsequently our budget decisions. So in many respects there couldn't be a better time for us to be having these discussions, but I suppose what I'd say is we can't discuss too long, because actually some of the issues that have been outlined by colleagues on this call are of a quite pressing nature. So I think there are a set of strategic discussions which do inform budget discussions, but obviously that's the next stage of these conversations. It would be my observation.
Okay, thank you, Carl. That was a really useful discussion, and I want to thank colleagues for joining us today. I think we do need to probably come back on this and perhaps look in a little bit more detail on some specific issues as well, perhaps going forward, and maybe do a session specifically on community buildings or the community anchor network as we go forward. That's something obviously members can discuss when we get onto the work programme. But thank you so much to everyone who's joined this part of the discussion. We really appreciate it. And Andrew, I can see you're buzzing. I didn't know if you wanted to come in or not. I don't think he is. That's all right. I just wanted to check because I can see a purple light around your head, but I think we're all right. So thank you, colleagues, and we've finished this session, and you can leave now if you want to, and we'll be moving on to our next item. So thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks a lot. I'm just going to give colleagues a second to leave. And thank you to our voluntary and community sector partners for joining us as well. So thank you, Val, Paul and Andrew, and Andy Petra, should I say. Thanks a lot. So we are going to move on to our second item. And we have planning colleagues joining us now. They are here with us. John Buddle, I think you're going to start things off on the planning, on the supplementary planning documents. So shall I hand over to you?
Yes, please. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry. I think Lee's going to just put the presentation on screen for us, and then I'll talk you through the presentation as we're going through, and then have any questions at the end.
Thank you, John.
Cheers, thanks, Lee. So we're coming today to talk about 3 documents. So I'm going to talk you through the first 2 documents. My name's John Buddle. I'm a team leader in the planning policy team. And then Amy Reddick is our biodiversity officer in our development management team, and she's going to talk us through the biodiversity net gain technical advice note. So we'll run through the presentation, and there'll be three different components to it, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So we're looking for input really from Scrutiny to highlight. So we're going to highlight the scope of the documents for the purposes of public consultation. And then we'll set out at the end the timelines for the next steps for the public consultation and the adoption of the SPD. So we'll have a slide at those at the end of the presentation. So to start with, kind of the first things first, what is an SPD? So we adopted the local plan, and now we're producing supplementary planning documents, and these really look at what policies were set before and then provide additional clarity to those. So these documents are all related to design and build on the local plan policy LP24, which is the design policy, which has lots of different criteria. So these have been put together to provide additional guidance to that policy to hopefully take it to the next level down so people can really understand the council's expectations. So once SPDs are adopted, supplementary planning documents, you'll hear me referring to SPDs during this presentation from now on. So if you always remember back to their supplementary planning document. Once adopted, those are material considerations in planning decisions, but they don't form part of the statutory development plan, which means they're not subject to an examination in public. So we can then update them sort of a series of times throughout the lifetime of the local plan. So they're much quicker to respond to kind of issues which we may need to change if they're not quite working correctly. So the SPDs are subject to public consultation. We're looking at having that in October, so later this month, and then that will run through to the SPDs will have to be adopted by Cabinet. So if we could have the next slide, please. So the first document we're going to talk you through is the House Builder's Design Guide. And this is for the people who build houses. The next ones you'll see are for people who kind of live in houses. One of the things probably to get out there right from the start, bit of a white elephant if we didn't mention the planning white paper and the level of planning reform which is being talked about nationally. We're conscious of that, and we have been conscious of that when we've been developing these. But these are really looking to set a quality local guidance document. So we don't think the content of these would be unduly affected by the white paper and any changes that may put into the planning system. So the two, subject to seeing what the final white paper outcomes are, should very nicely fit together and have a strong local guidance and a quality place for everyone to live in Kirklees. I mean, the second thing to follow on is it's actually interesting listening to kind of the tail end of the debate about the impact of coronavirus. I think never have people's homes really been more important than now. People have been stuck in their kind of immediate environments much more than previously. And what we've seen is the kind of the look, the feel, the space that people have in and around them is increasingly more valuable than actually maybe the location, the wider location which they live in. It's very much kind of zoomed into people's individual homes. And then the third thing to talk through is that the local plan, brilliant, we got that in place, and that was about getting the housing numbers up in the district, but we want to make sure that the actual quality comes with those houses. It's not just about numbers. So the purpose of the SPD is set out on this slide. It looks at getting in good design for the district, achieving high quality design and also layouts of the wider site, and provide a greater clarity of our expectations from developers. So when they're coming in with schemes, they know right from the outset what our expectations are, and the closer they follow to the guidance, the greater the likelihood is that they'll get planning permission for these larger sites. So if we go on to the next slide now about the drivers of site design in Kirklees. The design of development should really be considering all these wider policy challenges when they're putting forward the site, layout and design. So we're looking at a series of factors there, and we're noticing that good design is really important at the minute with people's health and well-being. So we're asking people when they're developing these sites to look at the broader context and how all these issues then drill down into the immediate or surrounding area and actually into how they develop the individual site. So you'll see the document is subdivided down into a number of key principles, and each of these key principles then has supporting text and design and access prompts for developers to follow. So we've tried to make it a really easy guide to understand, so at each step it'll be kind of giving prompts for consideration to check that the principles have been sort of listened to and put in place. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So this starts it off. none of this is kind of rocket science really. It's just trying to set a really good structure to lead people through what our expectations are. So the key principle is, firstly, developers need to look at the wider character and distinctiveness of the area where they're planning to build these homes within. We know Kirklees is a really diverse area, sort of north and south. The characteristic areas are very diverse. So you've got kind of the more built up areas and then the rural fringes. So that's really got to be a key understanding for the context of what people want to live in, the type of houses that they want to live in, and make sure that they adhere to kind of that local built form as a starting point. So if we go on to the next slide. So again, these are key bullet points which everyone would expect to see on a list for what we'd expect a really good site to be designed like, to what these factors are to be taken into consideration. So we're looking at, for example, for slopes, so how would that lead to a constraint that the developer would need to overcome? Not just a simple, we can't build on it because it's a steep sloped site or something like that. It's actually be a bit adaptive to kind of some of the designs and put something in which actually responds to that, how that site is, constraints are laid out. Looking at, say, the infrastructure, where do the existing power lines go? How does that fit with surrounding land uses in the area, the open space? Does that need buffer zones? So this is kind of just a list, and in the document itself, it kind of goes through each of these characteristics and sets out our expectations against those. And one of the key points is around about connectivity. So making sure that we understand how that site fits with the surrounding street, the walking, cycling networks, both existing networks and new networks which are being proposed through the local plan. So if we go on to the next site, so using all those key principles, so the next slide. So the principles there should explain how that site layout is achieved. So if you just go back one, sorry. So the key principles then expect how we'd want that site layout to be achieved. So we're looking at, as a starting point, the density. We'd expect 35 dwellings per hectare. In town centres or areas with good public transports, we maybe think that density could be a little bit higher. In some areas, we may accept a slightly lower density if there's appropriate reasons why that site is better developed out in that way. And then again, there's a series of bullet points. They have key text within the document which sets those out. So we're looking at kind of the landscape and the site edges. How does a site kind of transition from maybe an open area currently, and how does that kind of that new interaction between the edge of the urban area and the rural area have a good feel about it? It's not just kind of an abrupt end. And looking at the street design, making sure that we've got really good inclusive spaces where people feel happy and safe. And again, it's all about that social well-being and making the communities feel like communities, not just kind of sterile developments. So if we go on to the next slide. So then this goes to that next level down, that final level of detail. So we're looking at what local materials and finishing we really expect within developments to reflect the character of the area. So it's not always just fitting in like for like. Sometimes it may be that you have a bit more of a cutting edge design if it again brings something new to the area and fits with that area in a good way. Making sure that the rhythm of the street feels natural and instinctive to that area. Try and create places where people really want to live and welcome people to Kirklees. And then on the next slide, it goes to the lowest level when we're looking at the individual house and how does that kind of respond to that immediate surrounding area for that individual unit and within that site, within that house itself. So to make sure that there's decent internal space standards for that. Never been more so important than currently, to make sure people don't feel like they're living in boxes in sterile environments. Looking at the outdoor space that people have access to, and making sure that there's kind of the ability for energy efficiency and storage of waste to be built into that site design at a very, very early stage. So if we go on to the house extensions and alterations document. So this is, the one before was about bigger sites, about how those get developed out by house builders. This is for people who own homes, so people's houses. How do they want to adapt that via extensions and alterations? Again, the closer people follow the guidance, the increased likelihood of planning permission. We're recognising that people's needs change over time, and that people do need to be able to respond to those changes in their lifestyle and within their individual house. People shouldn't always have to move. So this is again trying to look at that clarity of if you comply with this guidance, the likelihood is that you will get planning permission. So the purpose of this SPD, the supplementary planning document, we're looking at good design, as we've said before, and advice for well-designed proposals. We want to give that clarity so people can understand what the expectation is, and really can try and talk people through in the document where they can seek guidance and what they need to understand to be able to get a well-planned extension or alteration to their house. So on the next slide, you'll see that the document has these areas where we're looking to give advice. So people have the information to be able to, before they start spending any money on an application or getting any plans or anything drawn up, people can, off their own back, understand the process and how likely it is that they will get planning permission. We think the better the understanding of an individual, the better that they will be able to see the chance of their planning permission being granted. So we're looking at permitted development, so that's to give people an understanding what they can already do without submitting a planning application. And then we're looking at pre-application advice. So again, before someone submits any sort of formal plans to us, they can get advice about whether what they're doing is kind of within the right kind of parameters. And then the bottom bullet points really there are the kind of the key constraints which would limit the likelihood of people being able to put an extension or alteration in without kind of responding to those issues there. So on the next slide, this is really kind of, even though you're dealing with an extension alteration, it's really important that people kind of take a little bit of a step back and zoom out a little bit. Because if you can understand what your surrounding street scene is like and undertake a bit of a kind of an informal site appraisal for that, you can kind of get a pitch for where your extension or alteration would fit within that, and whether it would, broadly speaking, be appropriate. So we're asking people to undertake a bit of an assessment, so the characteristics of the existing house, the site and the surrounding area and the local character of that. And again, if it all fits within that context quite comfortably, the likelihood is that planning permission would be granted. If you're kind of outside of that site context, you'll need to add more justifications. So we're not saying it's going to be you can't have anything. It's you'll need to justify your approach much more vigorously than if it was within those parameters. And then people should use that information to be able to inform the position, size and scale of their extension. So on this slide here about the general design principles, what we've got in the document is lots of diagrams to try and make it visually easy to follow. So that diagram you see on the right hand side there, and we've got a couple more examples in a couple of slides time, is something we've been really keen to introduce to this document. With the green showing that it's acceptable, we also have diagrams where they have a red extension like that, which would show it's unacceptable. So a lot of these points, again, are nothing that you wouldn't expect to do. It's just setting out that clarity of guidance. So we're looking at what the impact on the original house would be, talking to neighbours what the impact would be on the neighbours. It's not just maybe about that person, it's about the future occupiers of those dwellings as well. So it's trying to make sure that we're making streets that really feel good for a long time, not just kind of hit and miss because one person's wanted this to happen or that to happen when they lived there. It's actually about the longevity of the environment in that area. Looking at sustainable design, parking, always a contentious issue. So we're just trying to hit everything right up front to try and ease kind of the burden of justification that may be needed at a later date by individuals wanting to extend their houses. So on the next slide, it shows that the document provides detailed guidance on all of these different elements of likely extensions and adaptations, alterations that people would do to their houses. So we've got guidance in there about extensions to the rear, front and side of the property. So you can see a side extension there. We're looking at dormer windows, roof extensions, balconies, outbuildings and bungalows. So we've tried to capture what we think would be the most common type of improvement that people would want to make to their individual house. So on the next page, this is just to give an example of more of the types of images which we've got in there. So we've got an image on the left hand side there which shows an extension in somebody's rear garden, and what you can see is we're trying to set out the dimensions that if somebody sits comfortable within that, they can undertake those kind of measurements themselves. They can get a really clear understanding of what they need to do before they've spent any money on any form of architect's fees or anything like that. So again, that clarity hopefully works to make it an efficient process for people involved in it as well. And then the diagram on the right hand side looks at the building line of a corner plot and shows how that extension, which is shown in green there, fits within that. So there'll be another diagram which showed if that pushed beyond that black line, that would be inappropriate at that point. And then we have some images at the bottom of dormer windows and roof extensions and how those good design of those fits comfortably in, and again bad design of it is shown as a kind of a red within the document. So that gives you kind of a very quick canter through those two documents. So I'm going to pass over to Amy now to talk about the biodiversity net gain, and then if we come back to questions at the end. Okay.
Thanks, John. So my name's Amy Reddick and I'm Kirklees Biodiversity Officer, and I'll just take you through the Biodiversity Net Gain Technical Advice Note. The next slide, please, Lee. Thank you. So, we have produced a technical advice note which is intended to provide interim guidance on biodiversity net gain for developments within Kirklees until the Environment Bill is passed. The aim is to progress this note to an SPD once the bill is passed and further information is available from the government on key aspects. The current government ambitions on house building and infrastructure are likely to accelerate the land use change with implications for biodiversity. The production of this guidance note will support Kirklees' local policy to protect and enhance biodiversity and provide biodiversity net gains through good design, as well as the wider government agenda on house building. The guidance note is split into two sections. Section A, which is aimed at providing clarity to developers, and Section B, which sets out our expectations for technical experts such as ecological consultants. Next slide, please, Lee. Thank you. So what is biodiversity net gain? Biodiversity net gain has been a requirement by the National Planning Policy Framework and also by our own local plan policy LP30. The introduction of the Environment Bill will mandate the use of a metric to demonstrate a 10% net gain in biodiversity post-development. This means that development must leave biodiversity in a measurably better state than before. Biodiversity is vital for the health of our natural environment and strengthens ecosystem services such as climate control, oxygen production, and has recreational benefits. Next slide, please. So these diagrams just illustrate the general principle of biodiversity net gain. In the past, we might have had this situation where developments were fully replacing the natural environment with built infrastructure, resulting in a biodiversity net loss. Recently, the realisation of the importance of the natural world and shifts in practice to conserve our biodiversity mean that important habitats are often retained or replaced, resulting in less significant losses or no net loss. However, in order to help our natural world to recover, in the future development will not only need to conserve important habitats, but create new ones in order to result in a biodiversity net gain. Next slide, please. So how do we calculate a measurable net gain in biodiversity? By using the biodiversity metric 2.0, which has been developed by DEFRA and Natural England. This provides a standard methodology to allow developers to demonstrate that they are achieving what is required and for local planning authorities to assess that our policies are being met. The metric calculations are based on the size, distinctiveness, condition, strategic location and connectivity of each habitat parcel within a site. The score for each habitat parcel is combined to give a baseline value in biodiversity units. Post-development value is calculated in a similar way, and then the change in biodiversity units is calculated by subtracting the baseline value from the post-development value. This metric cannot be used in all cases, such as where damage to irreplaceable habitats, including ancient woodlands, are predicted. In this case, we expect developers to engage with us directly to arrange bespoke compensation. Next slide, please. So Section A sets out Kirklees' approach to biodiversity net gain. We'll be asking for a 10% gain in biodiversity, which is in line with national policy. And this will only apply to major development, so generally over 10 dwellings for the time being, although this may change in the future. The metric must not supersede the mitigation hierarchy as required by the National Planning Policy Framework, and both should work to complement each other. The mitigation hierarchy states that significant harm should be avoided in the first instance, minimised if this is not possible, and compensated for as a last resort. We'll be expecting developers to submit a plan showing how the mitigation hierarchy has been applied throughout the development process. So this includes the baseline value of their site, the predicted post-development value of their site, and any details of biodiversity compensation. Our role as the local planning authority will be to verify these plans, including whether the values are correct, the details of biodiversity compensation are sufficient, and that a 10% net gain has been achieved post-development. In addition to this, a management plan will also be required for a period of at least 30 years, which gives time to allow habitats to establish and mature. Next slide, please. In some cases, developers may be unable to meet the required biodiversity net gain on site, and in this case, they will be required to offset biodiversity at an off-site location. If the developer owns land which is relatively close to the development site, then they may utilise this. If not, then a commuted sum will be taken to put towards biodiversity management on council-owned land or a habitat bank. Commuted sums will be secured through an appropriate legal agreement, similar to how we take open space payments now. Efforts will be made to keep biodiversity offsetting as close to the development site as possible to ensure they benefit the local people and wildlife. However, in some cases, it may be necessary to put commuted sums into projects further away, dependent on what the habitats which require compensation are. Of course, offsetting and taking a commuted sum are a last resort, and we will be encouraging developers to secure biodiversity net gains on site in the first instance. Next slide, please. And then the final section B, it sets out our guidance for ecological consultants. So this is the level and standard of information required and the rules and principles for habitat creation and enhancement. And what we'll expect from them are no trading down, so this means not replacing habitats such as species-rich meadows with monoimmunity grassland. Enhancement, not transformation of the natural world. So keeping replacement habitats in the same general category, so woodland for woodland, grassland for grassland, wetland for wetland, etc. Realistic and achievable goals. So habitats need to be relevant to the local area. For instance, it's unlikely that an upland hay meadow could be established at the edges of a sports pitch, but you might be able to, with a good management plan, establish a wildflower meadow in the same location. No loss of woodland cover, so any woodland that will be lost from site will expect to be replanted either on site or again at that off-site location. And no loss of ecological functions. So if a site is important for foraging bats, for instance, we'd expect that function to be retained post-development. The introduction of the Environment Bill and this guidance presents an opportunity to fund enhancement of biodiversity within Kirklees while still providing much needed housing and infrastructure. Next slide, please, Lee. And I'll just pass back over to John to take you through the next steps for the rest of the documents.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So you'd have seen on the previous slide, we've got the Quality Places consultation. So that's going to actually consist of 4 documents that we're going to consult on. So you've got the two supplementary planning documents we've talked about earlier on, the House Builders Design Guide and the Extensions and Alterations SPD. We're also at the same time consulting on the Open Space supplementary planning document, which had previously been to scrutiny at the beginning of the year, and the Biodiversity Net Gain Technical Advice Note. So these are all going under the Quality Places banner because they're all about trying to make sure that really the quality comes with the development, not just kind of the numbers. So that's why I think it's really important as well to put them out in one go so people can see that we have tried to consider everything in the round rather than incrementally putting out guidance. And then on the next slide, you'll see the next steps. So we've got public consultation at the end of October, and then we'll be looking to Cabinet decision to adopt in early 2021. So that's the end of the presentation. So ready to any questions or comments.
Okay. Thank you both, John and Amy. That was a really interesting presentation. So members, if you could let me know if you want to speak. I've got John first. So sorry, Councillor Taylor, go ahead.
Thank you. Quite a few points actually. Welcome it and thank you for your presentation. However, I'm a grumpy sod, and actually I'm a reflector. And actually, the whole point of us having scrutiny panels is to scrutinise stuff. So when it's presented in front of us and we're expected to respond to it straight away, it's much more difficult for us to scrutinise. So I accept we are where we are, but it's just another comment from me that, you know, we need to take these scrutiny panels seriously and give the members the information, all of the information. I know we had some reports, but all of the information in advance to allow us to actually reflect so that we can properly scrutinise. So it has been made more difficult by that information being presented to us today. That said, I welcome it and I'm fully supportive. One other thing I tend to do on these panels is proofread documents. So on the actual documents that were sent to us, so the reports, on the one on the House Builder Designs SPD, the purpose of the report, the scope is one word on it. It should really be 2. And on page 87 of my report, which is section 2, you've listed the draft SPD will set out key principles, introduction, context, etc. Under context, you've got urban grain instead of urban gain, which is an interesting one. But to the more important parts, thank you for defining larger sites, because I was going to ask that question, but I think somebody mentioned it later on. So it's anywhere there's 10 or more houses, isn't it? One of my questions for you is what I've tended to see with the national house builders is you can go anywhere in the country and they're building the same houses. So they have a standardized model and standardized design, and they probably source the materials all from the same places. So have we reflected on how this is going to impact on national builders being able to adapt their business model to our differing needs, because our needs will be different even just across the district, never mind different from other parts of the country. So that's one question. I can't remember which report it was in, made mention of sloped sites. One thing I think we failed to do adequately, we'll just ask you guys to reflect on with sloped sites, is winter maintenance. So when you get sloped sites, you then have problems, and I'm sure all of the councils on here will have locations where they get a lot of grief every winter, where there are roads that are quite steep and aren't currently supported in terms of the spreading of salt and things in advance. So if we're building more houses, and as we get challenged on spaces, we will be looking at some areas where they are perhaps a bit steeper. So are we building that into the planning design? Are we building that into our thinking about how we will get people on and off those estates safely? And are we getting the money to pay for some more winter maintenance, perhaps? I love the stuff about architectural design, rather, because I do worry that these identity builds that are the same everywhere are not really what we would like, and it's not what people would like to live in. I think your points early on, John, about people are having to spend much more time in a small area at the moment under COVID, and yeah, I'm sure there are people that are finding it very, very difficult just as a result of the build of the property that they're living in. Then still on, I think it probably comes under architectural design, noise insulation. So I've dealt with a number of cases since I've been a councillor of people who live in either flats or in properties with party walls, where I don't think the noise insulation that's been put in has been adequate. So what you're getting is neighbour complaints about noise. I can hear them walking across the floor above, etc., etc. So perhaps just a reflection on that. Is there anything we can do to beef up that and perhaps do more checking of that as well? Because I know some of it is that, you know, the builder brings in their own building control these days, building control inspector to mark the homework. But if we could perhaps pick that one up, and then also talking about similarly noise, but also you talked about buffers between houses and perhaps you know, sort of industrial areas adjacent. And I know I'm dealing with two cases at the moment. One which is quite local to me, at the bottom of Lepton, where a business called Reliance Precision that do really, really high-end engineering. So they build to it's something like 5 microns, and if you think, well, just one strand of hair has 50 microns in it. That's how fine their precision is in terms of their engineering. They're concerned that there's a huge housing development going around their factory, and just the very nature of the how, well, one, when it's being built, but then how near those are going to be to that business could impact on their business. And then the second one I will share with you is over in Dewsbury, which is Dewsbury Rams, the rugby league club, that have one of those outdoor five-a-side courts. I was going to say 5G, but that's the wrong terminology. I can't remember what it is. But they've got a special surface on them, a very modern surface. They've built a range of houses next to that. Now all the people in the houses are complaining about the usage of the football pitch. So I think it's how do we build in that recognition about, you know, well, if you're going to build houses that are going to be adjacent to something that, I could give you another example with Shepley Spring, where they've had problems where houses have been built subsequently next to their factory, and then people complaining about the noise of the factory operating. So building in that noise insulation and that recognition and understanding of the noise that's going to be impacted. It's no good buying a house and then when you move in, I'm going to give you another one. Sorry, they're just piling out of them. In Barnsley Road up in Flockton, at one point in Barnsley Road, there's a chicane that was put in to try and deal with traffic issues up there. A lady's bought a house by the chicane on one of the new estates and is now complaining about the noise. You know, so it's all of those. How do we try and mitigate and pick up for the noise that can be caused by that? You talk about going out for consultation. I'm just wondering if you can share with us any more about your approach to that public consultation, how you plan on doing it, and how we're going to make sure that we're talking to the right people. Because what you will get with all the interested parties will no doubt respond. I've said this on several scrutiny committees before. I'm a big advocate of place standards, and place standards taught me that what you need to do is go and talk to people who don't want to talk to you if you really want to get proper public consultation. And my immediate thought on this one, John, was around people who've recently bought houses. So there are plenty of new estates that have been built across the district what's their experience been? How do they feel about the new house that they're living in? And what would their reflections be when they were looking at this type of document? I don't quite know how we do that, so it's a bit of a challenge really, but I think that would be helpful and valuable. I actually read all the reports that were sent out to us, and in the one on, I think it's probably in all of them, where you talk about promoting good design, you talk about the form, scale, layout, and details of developments, respecting, enhancing the character of the townscape. I just wonder if it's possible to put the word sympathetic in there as well, because I just think we need to be sympathetic to what's already there. And the final item J on all of them says the provision of public art where appropriate. Could we change from where appropriate, say, is actively encouraged? Because, you know, let's I'm sure if one of your office colleagues, Kath Davis, was on the call, she'd be pushing for us to try and encourage it. So I'm just trying to be a bit ambitious there, really. Sorry, I'm rushing through this because I'm conscious of the people who want to speak as well. On the one around housing extensions and alterations, when you talk about the different types of extensions and alterations, you quite rightly reference different types of extensions, windows, balconies, etc., outbuildings. You don't mention garages specifically, and I just wonder whether it's worth mentioning garages specifically or whether you're covering that with outbuildings. But I know that I've had cases where, you know, that there have been difficulties with the size of garages that people sometimes want to build. And then on the biodiversity bit, Amy, thank you for that. My two questions really around when we're looking at that biodiversity gain, what timescale are we looking over for defining that? Because obviously, if they're going to do any planting or anything, the contribution that makes is not going to be immediate. And particularly in cases where we've had to go down the line of mitigation because they're destroying something as part of that development, you know, is that defined in any way? And if it's not, does it need defining in some way so that we're clear and we understand when you can do that proper comparison to make sure that they are delivering what's been asked for? Because I can guarantee you'll get councillors asking you that after these developments go forward, because we'll get residents that'll be giving us a hard time about it. So it's probably worth just reflecting on that and trying to incorporate something now. And similarly, if we do go down the line of biodiversity offsetting, and obviously that's going to be in the smallest minority of cases we can get away with, but it'd be interesting in understanding a bit more about the councillor's role in that. So if that was something, development was happening in my ward, what would my involvement, how would I be engaged, what opportunity do I have to have a say in that? Because some of it gets quite technical and I think I would struggle. And then my other worry, and I'm sure the councillors on the call will have similar experiences, where Section 106 monies hasn't gone as well as we would have liked. So if we do go down the line of biodiversity offsetting, what is the timescale for spending that money? Would that be something we set an ambition for now, albeit that it probably is something that may have to be negotiated? But my worry is, you know, with some Section 106 money, they have up to 5 years. If it isn't spent with 5 years, it's returned to developers. So I just would be interested in that. And I'm sorry, Chair, for hogging the agenda of the call, but I think I'll stop there if that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. So there were quite a few points there. We might need Councillor Taylor to come back at some point if you're not sure on all of them. But John, if you want to start and then we'll move on to Amy.
Yeah, I'll try and go through them in kind of the order they came up, if I can kind of try and remember them. So in terms of national house builders and kind of impact on them, if I've understood the question correctly, we've tried to consult with some to try and get an understanding about what their kind of concerns would be in terms of new design standards coming in. We didn't get a tremendous amount back, to be honest, but we're going to deliberately target a number of those type of developers through the consultation, so write to them individually. We've also done a lot of viability work previously on that to kind of get a benchmark about kind of that headroom within Kirklees, and we know there is kind of a bit of headroom to try and look to push that design standard. So we're not going to be unduly impacted, and quite often we do find that we're getting when we ask for things from developers, they'll quite often respond to them. However, the more information we can front load to the developers when they're doing their site appraisal work up front before they purchase the site, they can then factor in those if there is any enhanced costs for the kind of the local things which we'd be expecting. So it's all down to viability really of schemes, and we think the clearer we can be with our guidance, the clearer they can factor that in up front. But during the consultation, we'll be holding forums with agents, so developer agents, and also volume house builders to try and make sure that we wouldn't see an impact upon the numbers being delivered within Kirklees. Sloping sites and kind of winter maintenance, pretty tricky one to try and solve in some parts of the district, I suspect. We also recently published a highways design guide, so that's an approved supplementary planning document. Without going through that now, I think that would deal with gradients within that document itself. So I think that would be the appropriate place for that to be signposted. So the noise insulation. So on that, I think the issue that we have with noise insulation is predominantly a building regulations issue. A lot of the time, it's kind of quite hard because planning and building regulations sit so closely together, but they try and make sure that one deals with one deals with the other. So we see that as being building regulations and not one for really the SPDs to interfere within, because the design, the standards which are within building regulations, if they're adhered to, should adequately solve the issue that you've kind of raised there, I think. Yeah, trying to go through now the notes I've made. So the buffer zones between houses and industry. Without kind of knowing those individual schemes, I kind of know they are and a little bit about them. I think that's a bit of a watch this space going forward. I think the case officers on those will have tried to come to an appropriate balance between separation distances, but I think that's something that the guidance now would seek to set more clearly. We've also worked with lots of colleagues and will continue to through the development management process who would have input into that. So environmental health colleagues looking at kind of the appropriate distances and noise and impacts between housing and business or whatever the sort of the two adjoining land uses are. So now consultation. So the consultation that we're looking at putting in place, I can give you a little bit more detail on that. So just bear with me a second. So we're looking at having a 6-week consultation. So we're going to extend that beyond the 4 weeks, which is kind of the statutory period. So we're trying to make that a bit of a longer time period now to give people additional time to comment. During that time, we're going to be working with workshops with agents, developers, landowners and builders, which I kind of previously mentioned. We'll also be going to have a press release which goes out at the start of the consultation, which will go in onto the council's press release page, the Kirklees Together website as well, and we'll be writing to interested parties. So that includes anybody who's previously expressed an interest within planning and said they want to continue to be informed about new planning documents coming forward. So we'll be writing to them from our database. And also there's to apply with the planning regulations, there's a list of what they call prescribed bodies. So bodies such as Yorkshire Water or any kind of other ones along those formats that we write to. So we have got a pretty comprehensive mail out that we'll be doing, and then the website as well, the Kirklees website, would have a link on the front page for the first couple of weeks, and then there'll be a dedicated web page within there that would signpost people to our online consultation where people can get involved that way around. We're also offering the opportunity, because of the time at the minute and kind of not wanting lots of people to be handling the same hard copies of documents, if people do want a hard copy of the documents, they can write to us and we'll mail them out to them. So that's kind of a little bit of an additional thing this time around, with the consultation taking place during this time. I think I've addressed most of the points. If I've not, please come back to me and see if I can give you some further clarity.
Yeah, I think if we're going to Amy for now, and then I do want to just give the opportunity for Councillor Eastwood to come in, and then we'll bring Councillor Taylor back if that's okay. So Amy, did you want to cover your points off?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'll try and go through these, but the first one was at what stage these provisions will be provided. I think, as with normal conditions, it will be a specific phase of the development, and we'll aim for that to be as early as possible. I mean, in some cases, if it's an offsetting site that they're putting the biodiversity enhancements on, that could even be before they even start the main development. They could get those in place. If it's on site, it may be a little bit more difficult depending on what the construction phase is like, but the idea will be to get that in as early as possible, give the chance for the habitats to mature, and that allows the wildlife to recover quickly, and also gives the residents, when they move in, things will already be established. So that will be the aim with that, but it will be tied to a specific phase of the development. And also to ensure that it is delivered, the management regimes will have to have a monitoring regime as well. So this will be, usually it'll be on like a five-year basis, but maybe in the early stages probably like an annual, and that will mean that, you know, these clear monitoring regimes pick up on any problems, and if it's not being delivered, then that will be a case for enforcement. And so there shouldn't be a case where what is specified in the plans is not being delivered. I think the next point was councillors' role in the offsetting sites. Our aim will be to have a habitat bank, and this is tied to another part of the Environment Bill, which is nature recovery networks, which look at sort of tying in the spaces that we have already, so local wildlife sites and national parks, and looking at where enhancements will be most beneficial. So looking across all the districts, we'll probably end up with community involvement to put sites forward, and looking at our own land. So that's something that councillors could be involved in, rather than trying to look at each development individually and finding a specific site for it. We'll have the sites already, and we'll know where the enhancements need to go. And then I think the final point on Section 1 agreements, they may not be, it might not be tied into a 106 agreement. It might be a conservation covenant, which is coming in with the Environment Bill as well. But we're not sure on what the details of that will be yet. It's more of a legal agreement between the landowner and the developer, so less of a 106 agreement. I think I'll probably defer to Matthias for actual timescales of a 106 agreement. He'll probably have a better idea than me on how to explain that.
Thanks, Amy. He's going to come in at the end and scoop up all the answers, if that's okay. So I'm just going to bring in, and I know Councillor McBride wants to come in, but I'll just bring in the members first. So Councillor Eastwood.
All right, thanks for that. Yep, thanks for the reports. Very informative. Just a few points. On the, I'll try to be quick as well, given the time. On site layout, I think at the moment there seems to be a bit of cramming going on into site design, and that I think also comes to the detriment of some of the objectives that you're trying to achieve. I mean, we keep going on about safer cycling provisions within the infrastructure and things like that. And obviously, if you're cramming in more houses, in my opinion, the less safe it could be for people out on the bikes. We had one occasion recently where the applicant and landowner only wanted 20 plus houses, but then the planning team said no, government guidelines say you've got to have a minimum of 30 plus. So, you know, if the applicant's only wanting 28, why insist on them having that higher level of residences being built? What else have we got? Yeah, site layout as well. More thought, I think, into the amount of space for the actual road network. I mean, we had a case locally where garbage trucks were not going down particular streets or cul-de-sacs because one car was preventing them getting them down there. So I think there needs to be more emphasis on making in the calculations that there's more allowance for things like that, so that people aren't then phoning us to say our rubbish aren't being emptied for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever it is, and then having to arrange a second collection to make good what could have been collected if it was that bit wider. In terms of the actual buildings themselves, we keep seeing solar panelling being recommended, but we don't seem to be saying to developers or insisting with developers of including solar panelling in the designs. I mean, why is that? What else we got? Yeah, those houses that do have garages or storage spaces, you know, in the design, make them wide enough so cars can actually fit in the garage. I mean, you can, a small fork car might get in, but your Range Rover or your whatever, you can't open the doors. So you know, get the design right. Also, yeah, we mentioned about the various utensils and building materials. So what mentioned that? Right. Next. Well, quality control at the end of the piece. I mean, we again on one of our local developments, a whole street had issues with the developer and the finished product. And when we were called upon to sort of intervene, the developer complained that we were getting involved. I mean, but houses had been written sort of passed as fit for habitation, but then some of the issues that came up, leaking roofs within 3 months, 4 months of brand new house, and having that four times in the period of one winter, you know, how do things like that get signed off? So we need great quality control from our end. And then lastly, on safety, again locally, with a development that has been completed 2 years and the street lights aren't on yet. So I mean, how is that safe? You know, particularly now that the winter's coming. So that the residents are up in arms on that. You know, they fed up. You know, they're paying the council tax since whenever they moved in. So why have they got no street lights? So I think that's about it, really.
Thank you, Councillor Eastwood, and you made some very, very fair points there, particularly around the bins. That's something that comes up a lot with us as ward councillors as well. John, Amy, I don't know if you want to come back on some of those points now.
Yep, I can do. I think it's an interesting point, the first one about the density. So we do have a local plan policy, which we're looking at 35 dwellings per hectare being the starting point. And that's because we want to use land efficiently in its simplest term. The less houses we put on sites, the more sites we need to deliver the houses that we need. So through the local plan, we worked as 35 dwellings as a starting point. So that's why the officers will have gone back, I imagine, in that instance and asked them to revisit those numbers. What I'm not going to say is, though, that 35 dwellings per hectare is appropriate every single time. It may well have been that 28 was too low, but it may be that 35 may have been too high. I don't know the individual circumstances of that one, but we do try as a starting point to make sure that land is used efficiently, to make sure that we're delivering the numbers alongside the quality as well. So there's always that fine balance. I do appreciate that issue. As previously mentioned, the Highways Design SPD looks at the road network for any new developments coming forward now. So I know historically there are some streets which are difficult. Hopefully new sites going forward, if they adhere to the Highways Design Guide, which we published last year, which has guidance relating to refuge vehicles and kind of emergency vehicles and things like that, and minimum widths, that should really take care of that issue within that document. I'm just trying to cover off the other ones. I think some of the ones you mentioned, if you could maybe provide a little bit more detail to us by email afterwards. So along the street lighting not being on for 2 years, if you want to pass the information through to ourselves, we can see who that really should be passed on to. And the quality control ones, it's a very difficult issue, that, isn't it? I think, again, I don't know whether Matthias, I know, is going to come in at the end, whether he wants to kind of pick up some of those issues at that point. I think it's probably best to leave it to Matthias to kind of do that wrap around of that, because it's more the implementation of a planning permission and how that is actually enforced with building control colleagues, and at what point that moves to different parts within the council. I'm not sure if I missed anything at that point. If I have, I apologise. Hopefully Matthias can pick them up at the end.
Thank you, John. Richard, was there anything missed that Matthias should pick up at the end?
Just about the inclusion of solar panelling. Did you mention that?
Okay, we'll get. Oh, sorry, go on, John. Sorry.
Oh, so yeah. I think at the moment we don't have a local plan policy which can insist on that. So that relies upon national standards which have been put through the building regulations. Previously, we have had local policies which have looked towards that, but then guidance has been very clear now that that's a sort of a building regulations issue, and that's how that should be dealt with through the all the different Part L and things like that through the building regulations.
Thank you, John. I'll just make a quick point. I think there's some really good stuff in there in the SPDs, and also the technical note. I'm really keen on the technical note actually, and hopefully that will become an SPD once the Environment Bill or Act, which way around it has gone through. I'm just interested to learn about restoration difficulties sometimes when you're doing biodiversity offsetting, because, for example, if it did hit like an ancient woodland, trying to get that back in the human lifetime would be almost impossible. So it's just interesting to try and understand how that can happen, really, how we can get that restoration back. And this issues around leakage. So, for example, you could offset it somewhere else, but how do you know that's new gain or something that would have been there already? So that measuring of that success would be interesting, and whether we'll have any independent bodies that might look at that to say that, yeah, we've definitely got that 10% gain. I'll bring in John, if that's all right, Amy, and then we'll try and scoop things up if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. I think my dog's about to start kicking off as well. So I do apologise if he starts interrupting. Just one for Amy, and apologies, Amy, I forgot to mention this earlier on. Out in my patch, I represent Kirkburton Ward. We have a number of quarries, So would this biodiversity net gain technical advice note cover quarries as well, and how would that be managed? Because I think that's probably it certainly is a problematical area for us that represent these areas, because we get a lot of grief about it. But we appreciate a comment on that. Just on the public consultation, John, thank you for coming back on that. I'm a little worried that the public consultation sounded like we'll go and consult everybody but the public. So there was a lot of talk about interested parties, developers agents, volume house builders, etc. I would like us to consult Mr. Joe Public, the genuine people, but actively go out and talk to them. That's what Place Standard is all about, and actually get their views on things, because really we're in danger here of putting through an SPD that has been consulted on and discussed with all of the interested parties, who are all knowledgeable individuals, but actually, do we really understand what it's like for the people at the end of the chain? And it's to Richard's point, he was just making about, sort of leaking roofs and, bins not being collected and street lights not being on. We need to talk to people who have recently purchased properties to get their view on what are the things that have been a problem for them. And then we need to just do a bit of reflection on, are we addressing any of that in these SPDs, or is there something else that we ought to be doing collectively as a council to try and avoid those problems reoccurring somewhere else? It may be in planning control, it may be in policy, it may be somewhere else, it may be in special conditions. So really, I just think I can't stress strongly enough, Joe Public needs to be involved in public consultation, not just interested parties. And I think I'll probably leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. So, Amy, I don't know if you want to come back on the biodiversity points, and then maybe Matthias and Councillor McBride and John can scoop up any of the extra bits, if that's okay. Go ahead, Amy.
Thanks, Chair. Just on your points about ancient woodland, that can't be compensated through the metric. So if you're losing ancient woodland, then you can't get biodiversity net gain through the metric, essentially. So that would require a bespoke sort of compensation scheme, and probably involve, us, the Woodland Trust, Wildlife Trust, that kind of thing. And also there's a spatial risk kind of factored in the metric. So the further away from a development site you are compensating for, the higher the risk is. So if you're further away from a development site, you're probably going to have to compensate higher than you would if you were doing it closer. So that kind of gives developers that incentive to do it as close as possible to the site, essentially. And then John's point on quarries, yes, they will be included in the metric. Quarries, they're quite a good opportunity, usually, quarries, for biodiversity enhancement, because usually the land that they're going on is, agricultural land, doesn't have that high of an ecological value to start with. But by looking at, the restoration scheme after the quarry is finished, it can be, really good opportunity to provide a lot of biodiversity enhancements. The problem is, obviously, it's over a very long time. So you have to kind of factor in that you are going to be losing habitats essentially for a while. And if there's any important ones to start with, and that might require compensation immediately, but usually they'll provide a biodiversity net gain in the future, but they will be assessed with the metric. Yes, I think that's all the points covered, so I'll pass over.
Thank you. So I don't know who wants to come first, Matthias or Councillor McBride.
Matthias, go up.
Okay, thank you, Councillor McBride. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree. I think that the comments being raised today are about how do we make Kirklees, in its new sense, a better place in terms of new build design and place making, because that's what this set of guidance is about. How do we make Kirklees better? Yeah, build on what we've got, and how do we improve it? And that is about asking house builders to do better quality designs, more contextual designs for their areas that they're in, stressing the idea about It's not about numbers, it's about quality. But yes, we should use land that is a precious resource efficiently, but that can be done with different housing types and designs. It doesn't have to be the same identikit houses that some of you are making very valid points about, that are land hungry and don't necessarily make efficient uses, and they don't always respect topography. So these design guides are about setting the tone about, if you come to developing Kirklees, and we welcome the investment, we want quality, and this is giving you a clarity about that expectation, and that should inform decisions that developers have with landowners about what a value of a site is, and that should give them some certainty. I think going through the chain of questions, what was coming out around the implementation, around delivery of planning obligations, planning conditions, road adoptions, which is a thorny issue, and it is a bit of a last in the building process, and it is the last thing to happen. The surface on the street lights going in, that final sign off from the developer being responsible for the estate to the council as a highway authority adopting it. These design guides, if you go back to the highway design guide, the 3 you've got before you today for consultation, and the technical note, and our next suite of documents we're intending to bring forward, are all about giving clarity to communities about what they can expect developers to be providing, what they should expect their neighbours to be able to build for a house extension, what's reasonable, what's fair between a neighbour and a proposed neighbour who wants to build an extension on their house. And so I will take away the comments that you're making about how do we get it a bit better, and a bit better in delivery, and that issue about solar panels. They are matters for building regs. Government are really clear with us at the minute on housing. We can't go beyond the building regs. If they change the rules, then as John said at the start of the presentation, these documents are living documents. We will update them and bring them back through the consultation process. And just to pick up on that final point about how do we engage with the community, this is a public consultation. This isn't targeted at particular groups. There will be those groups who want to come and comment, the architects, the planning agents, the house builders, the landowners, the usual posse of people who are interested in what the council's guidance and standards are. But we are interested in what our communities think about our guidance, because if our communities buy into the documents, then we hope our members who make decisions on the major planning applications also buy into those documents and use them as the starting point when they are weighing up decisions on planning applications, when they're going to be at the planning committees. So I hear what members are saying. I think there were specific things outside of planning, but it was, as you said, Councillor Taylor, about, is it a different part of the council? Because the public perception is you're just the council, sort it out. Yeah, whether it's planning, highways, environment, street scene, whoever. So I will pick those up with my colleagues, and we'll try and be a bit more uniform on that. But in terms of planning compliance, just to finish the point, we are very clear as a council that if you grant a planning permission in Kirklees, we expect you to build it. And if you make an obligation and sign up to a legal agreement that you're going to give us money or pay for something to happen, we expect that to be delivered, and we'll take enforcement action much more rigorously and quickly to ensure that developers do what they're meant to do, and that builds confidence in the planning system. So I hope that sort of summarises, I think, where the points were coming through. But if there are specifics, do email us, councillors, and we'll pick up those specific sites that you had questions on about, sort of snags and niggles for the end of the building phase. Is that all right, Chair? I don't know if I've covered most of it, but if I have, please let me know.
That's helpful. Councillor Eastwood, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask another question? No. Okay, Councillor Taylor.
Just one point I want to come back to Matthias on the point about the public consultation, and I'll push it again. People lead busy lives. This is what we learned through Applying Standard. People don't volunteer to come and be consulted. We need to actually go and talk to them. So we need to have to go and search them out and find them. If you put something online, they won't pick it up. They, you know, to be honest, they're probably more interested in the latest soap opera or something like that, or what their children are doing at the weekend, rather than, you know, the fact that Kirklees is launching a public consultation on, you know, sort of some planning advice. But they do have a very valuable contribution to make. And I can't stress enough, we do need to find a way to go out and find those people that have recently bought brand new houses in developments in Kirklees, and talk to them about their experience and how they would feel about if this planning supplementary document had been in place when their house was built. So, and I will just keep pushing that one, Matthias, sorry.
All right. No, fair. Let me speak to the comms team, because the comms team have ways of communicating messages perhaps that I'm not savvy enough with. So
just tell them I was banging on about place standards on that.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of time. So, Councillor McBride.
Very quickly, I think this is hugely helpful to all concerned, councillors, to developers and so on. But I'd like to reflect on the fact this is probably all that will remain of planning. If you look at the white paper, all the strategic powers of local authorities, including local planning, effectively are being taken away. It's going to be categorised. And what is not taken away completely will be referred to the combined authority. So retain concern over design, layout, architecture, biodiversity, really, really important. But it's in the detail, that's where our powers remain. We are being significantly asset stripped. You must look at the white paper and what is being proposed there, because all that will be left is what you've been talking about today. The rest will effectively have gone. So you need to look at the white paper, what is intended. Well, what is intended that will not remain, and which is all strategic planning effectively.
Thank you, Councillor McBride. I can still see Councillor Taylor's and Matthias's hands up. Is that just on? Just not? Yeah. Okay. Great stuff. I won't labour on. This is so interesting. I think we could talk about it, you know, for ages, really. And again, I think it's probably just a point for us to think about how much we put on the on the agenda as well. But you know, maybe not to cover now, but maybe in writing. Just for me, just be useful to know is how are we going to measure that 10% gain, and will there be an independent assessment of it, or will it come via the council? So maybe just a note on that, Amy. Is that okay? Because I know we're really behind at the moment, so that'd be great. Yeah, thank you. Oh, thanks, Amy. Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Tom. You've been sat there patiently as well in the background, so thank you for that. And you can leave now if you want. We're just going to move on to the work programme, but thank you very much for joining us. Thanks a lot. So members, thank you for sticking with me. So we're just moving on to the work programme now. Just a couple of points that I wanted to know before I bring members in. Just on housing, on the housing section. In our last scrutiny meeting, Ailey, who's one of our co-op team members, she mentioned about us potentially looking at the private rented housing sector market. And obviously we do have a team. So Lee, if we could add that onto the work programme, that's something that we discussed at the last meeting, and it was agreed as well. So that would be helpful if we could add that on. We also had an additional point from one of our residents. He contacted us at the last scrutiny panel to ask us to look at different points around air quality. Most of that we covered in the work programme, but there was one other point that he added, which was around the consideration of licensing of taxis and private hire vehicles to achieve a cleaner fleet. Now we discussed these points in the last meeting, and members seem to be happy with that. But I'm just double checking because we haven't noted it in the work programme. So if we could ask our colleagues in air quality just to explain where we're at on that specific point, would that be okay? Yeah, I think you're both saying yes to that. Great stuff. Thank you. And members, is there anything else you want to add about the work programme? I know, John, you've made some points today about how we scrutinise, so I'll certainly take those points on board for future meetings. I think they were fair points. Is there anything else that anyone wants? John, go ahead.
I just think it might be, whether it's the next meeting or the one after, but things seem to be moving with regard to the town fund for Dewsbury, and it may be worth asking for an update on where that is, because I think the formal submission, I think, is January. But I just think it'd be useful for us to get a bit of an update on where we are with that, because that's a huge investment potentially coming forward, and it would be useful to understand how we're progressing with that, I think. Yes,
I think that's a very fair point. Lee, could we try and just get an update on that, if that's okay?
Simon Taylor, probably the person to talk to.
I'll follow that up, yeah. No
follow
problem.
that up, yeah. Peter, I don't know if you've got anything to say on that, on the town fund?
I think you're quite right to concentrate on this. I haven't got any more detail than you have about it. You're right, the information about it is coming forward within the next few months. But I would like to say one very quick thing. You please pay close attention to the white paper. It's of great significance to the committee.
Okay, thank you. So we'll ask Simon then about the town fund as well. I think that's quite an important one, actually. So thanks for that. Is there anything else that the other thing I was thinking, members, obviously we've got new directors in place as well. So Colin Parr, I know he was in on the call in the background, but obviously it might be useful to have a formal introduction with the panel members as well. So we could do that. I'm going to be having a lead member briefing, but I think it'd be helpful for us all to have discussions with him.
It's David as well, isn't it? Because
yes,
they both sit across this, don't they?
They do. So I think that might be something we want to add on as well to our formal panel meeting as well, just to have some Q&A with those two as well. Is there any other? Is that okay? Yeah. Is there any other points that you'd like to add about the work programme? No? Perfect. All right, then we'll take on that board about the town fund, just to make sure we meet the timelines around that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Gareth and Lee, for all your work in the background as well. We're very thankful for all that you do. And thank you both, John and Richard and Peter, and we'll see you soon. See you in the next meeting.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, take care.